Thank you. Well, welcome. Nice to see some familiar faces and some new faces. Wait, is this a little loud, my voice? It's okay? Okay. Just right. Maybe it's more uncomfortable for me. So the cost of caring, is that a familiar term? Have you heard that before? Yes. Okay, perfect. Because it often is used when we're talking about understanding compassionate fatigue and burnout. And so the intention of this workshop is really to kind of anyone who's in like a prolonged caregiving role, right? So it's not just healthcare workers, it's educators, it's professional caregivers, nurses, doctors, victim services, it's leaders and helpers within church ministry, within business ownership, coaches, managers, and then there's often the informal caregivers group where many of us might find ourselves at some point in our life. Um, whether we're parents taking care of children of high needs, or we're spouses supporting another spouse, or friend or partner, or aging parents, loved ones with mental illness or addictions, none of us are untouched by this subject. And that's why it's very dear to my heart. And so, what I hope to focus our attention on is um, having a good understanding of what it actually is, what compassionate fatigue is. And I included vicarious trauma because often vicarious trauma is included within compassionate fatigue. And I'll kind of go over understanding those terms in the next slide, helping you to understand what those early warning signs might be for you and those indicators. Um, and also stewarding our strengths. And what I mean by that is um, each of us have been given unique abilities and talents and giftings and areas of service, and sometimes our personality, who we are, if we don't steward those gifts, we can sometimes um, I suppose we can over give to the point where there's personal costs on us, right? So it's about figuring out where those limits are for us, learning some practical strategies, and as well as just really reframing rest. I mean, when you think about it, we all need rest to refuel, to energize ourselves, and so sometimes we might have our own feelings related to what rest is, right? And so these are some of the takeaways that I hope that you collect from our meeting today, and also, taking time to rest is not about shirking your calling, right? It's just, as I like to say, it's like caring for the gift God has given you, your body, your mind, and your spirit, so we can continue to serve faithfully. And again, that's what within every capacity that we're currently in. And so my personal story, I actually was not planning on doing this, but as a Christian woman myself, I felt that this is important. So even though I stand up here as a therapist, as a person who oversees the therapy services at By Peaceful Waters, I've also been personally touched by compassionate fatigue and burnout. And so when I was 38, I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue. I had an episode where literally my body just said no more. And I crashed and I couldn't walk for about 2 months. My mom had to walk me. I could barely move. And I just had expanded all the energy that was in my body. And so I was told that that was a chronic fatigue crash. And fibromyalgia can be on a similar continuum. And then I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia. And a lot of people know what fibromyalgia means. It's like it can be from trauma, um, and it can be from stress. And at that time in my life, my children were 6 and 3. And so you can imagine how difficult it can be not to have energy to take care of young children. And when I look back and I think about, what were the contributing factors, um, and that's why I want to kind of differentiate, because when we think about burnout, it's often a workplace stress. And what I mean by that is sometimes the demands never stop. And we sometimes think we are these what's that commercial energy? The energy Duracell buddies, whatever. What is it? Thank you, the Energizer Buddy. So if you get to know Karen, I always mess up my sayings, but that's okay. And so we sometimes think we're limitless, right? And the reality is these bodies were not designed for that. And so um, sometimes workplace stress, the demands are too high and we just keep going as if, and it's not good for us. And I included in vicarious trauma because I was exposed to trauma in my workplace, my former job, that had an effect on my emotional state. And then I would say that what I brought to this story, not stewarding my gifts, probably added to it. And so though I speak here, although I stand before you from a therapist perspective, I also am sharing. I've lived through this, and when I was preparing for this workshop, I had because again, when I'm going through this, it's hard not to reflect on my own life, my own journey. I'm now in my 50s, so time has passed, and I'm in a much different place. But when I was praying to God, I was just saying, Lord, if there's any part of me that's still inside that connects work with worth, please eradicate that from me. And again, I had a dream that night, and you can take away your own meaning from what I'm about to state. I had a dream that night where I was standing in front of the mirror. I had a fly on top of my head. It kind of flickered and flew away. I saw something moving. I was slowly pulling it, and then I had a massive snake in both hands. And then I tried to throw it out, and it tried to bite me. And so my meaning, and I don't typically have visions or dreams like this, my meaning was shame was so embedded somewhere in my body and my belief that I felt that I had to work, that God took it literally from my thinking process and just got rid of it. And and so again, I don't typically have those types of dreams, but that was kind of my takeaway. The snake kind of represented some of the lies that I bought into myself, that were again deep rooted. And yeah, so again, that's just a little bit about who I am, how this has personally touched me. So there's a blank piece of paper on your table, and actually, just wait a second. So, let me just double check if something has changed in order. Okay. Okay, so there's a blank piece of paper on your table, and this is just kind of a little exercise that I just want you to kind of reflect on right now. So we know that compassionate fatigue and burnout don't tend to happen overnight. They build quietly, one responsibility, one emotional load, one expectation at a time. So let's just take the next couple of minutes to see what's on your plate. Okay? So you've got that blank sheet of paper, and maybe if you just want to draw a plate on your paper, and I want you to write all the things that you do, your responsibilities, your roles, your jobs, life needs, and issues presently. Just write as many concrete details as possible. Just think of a typical day in your life, what that looks like. Sometimes we don't take note of this, and that's why it's important to do that. So just take note of what's on your plate daily. What are some of those responsibilities and duties? And it could be good things too, right? And so if you didn't finish it, that's okay. We can leave that and we're going to come back to it at the end, at the very end. But again, it's hard to make changes if we don't actually know or are fully aware or conscious what's on our plate every day, right? And so I always say the first step to change is awareness. It's not the only step, but it's definitely the first step. And so I want to reference this quote here, which again, recognizing that, this is a famous quote: the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to walk through water without getting wet. So when you think about compassionate fatigue and burnout, how can we not be impacted by it, right? Um, and I'm just thinking of Romans. In Romans 12, it talks about we're called to mourn with those who mourn, but it doesn't say we're meant to drown with it, right? Stewardship means I acknowledge that this work affects me, but I need to tend to my soul too. I need to tend to my body, my limits, and my supports. So what is in the terms? And so hopefully you have a sheet on your desk that actually talks a little bit about compassionate fatigue and burnout. And so I just want to help bring some further clarity to what these terms actually mean. So we know compassionate fatigue has been described as the cost of caring for others who are experiencing emotional pain. I do like to say that it's an occupational hazard, which means that every helper who cares about their family member, their client, um, people within their ministry can eventually develop a certain amount of it. And the reason why I like symbolism, and so there's a picture of the heart. And so really what it is like my heart is tired, right? And so when you think about compassionate fatigue, my heart is tired. And so often it comes from emotional, physical exhaustion that caregivers, professionals have experience from continually caring for or empathizing with people in distress. So see it as a bit of a slow erosion of empathy, right? It doesn't mean that empathy disappears. It just becomes harder to access. You may still care deeply, but you may feel emotionally blunted, right? Or numb or depleted. When you think about that famous statement, I care, but I don't have anything left to give, right? And I trust some of these things that I'll be saying will be resonating with you. Another way of saying it is being in task mode rather than relational, right? Practical versus an emotional response. And again, I just want to go back to that earlier slide, like how can we not be impacted by being in a role where it's hard emotionally to be around people who are suffering. So we feel drained, we feel numb. Sometimes we feel irritable or frustrated, right? And again, these are all costs of caring. Vicarious trauma. What is that? And so for this, what I like to explain it as when we are witness to other people's suffering, or we have knowledge of their own trauma, that can affect our worldview around a sense of safety, around a sense of trust, and it can actually change us significantly. And I do believe I left, there's a couple of scales on each table, just as reference in terms of, a tool for compassion, fatigue assessment, burnout assessment. There's something there about trauma. But if I were even to, when we think about vicarious trauma, again, sometimes it's often clustered with compassionate fatigue. Sometimes folks can actually take on post-traumatic stress symptoms. And I'm just going to give you a couple. Some of those behaviors could be repeated, disturbing and unwanted memories, disturbing dreams of the stressful situation, suddenly feeling or acting as if the stress is happening now. Sometimes we can have strong physical reactions when something reminded us of it. So again, it's hard not to be impacted when we care and we bear witness to other people's suffering. But I think it's important sometimes to understand that we can too develop symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. We can feel emotionally and spiritually shaken, and we can have intrusive thoughts or images related to the other person's trauma, right? A sense of hopelessness. And so again, that's the vicarious trauma piece that can happen in a role of caregiving and professional helper. Burnout. So again, the imaging of burnout, that's why I like the papers stressing workplace. It's general exhaustion and disengagement from work stress. Often it's prolonged stress and heavy workloads. So again, it's the high demands, the low job satisfaction, a sense of powerlessness, feeling overwhelmed, maybe a difficult work environment such as conflict, and there's really no resolution or even conversations about how to manage it. Frustration with colleagues, maybe heavy shifts, inadequate supervision or inadequate support available to people who are working in those types of contexts. And so again, this can happen in any occupation. So compassionate fatigue is trauma related and kind of an exhaustion of caring. As for burnout is more stress related. And so again, just the key differences: compassionate fatigue, trauma related plus emotional depletion from caring. Burnout is chronic workplace stress and overload. And often these guys can co-occur. That's why in your diagram you see the overlap in the middle. They often can co-occur because when you care, your heart's going to be heavy, right? And you feel like, so there's a heaviness to the care, but there's also a physical heaviness in terms of the everyday role that you're in. So burnout often is too much demand, not enough resources or control. So I guess my question for you right now, just you don't need to answer this out loud, but just to kind of do maybe an internal check. Am I exhausted because I care too much or because my system demands too much, or both? And I'll read that. Am I exhausted because I care too much or because my system demands too much? Or maybe it's both, because the both happens quite often together. I'm going to try something in this room tonight. I don't know if I'm going to be successful, but it's a bit of a scale. So let me just see if kind of want to do an anonymous where everybody at is in terms of their health right now. And again, it's anonymous, so you can go on your cell phone. I don't know if you guys can zoom in on the QR code up there with your cell phones if you have it with you. It's random. There's no identification. I do this all the time in staff meetings. But it really just gives you a sense of where people are at today. Because often with compassionate fatigue and burnout, we feel we've done something wrong. So let's just take it away right now and normalize that this is something that many people experience. And let me know if it's not working, because then I can give you the web. Is that working up there? Yeah. Okay, perfect for all those tech savvy folks in the room. If anybody is actually interested in doing this with any of your people, this is it's called the Mentimeter, and you can just create an account and log in, mentimeter.com. And it's actually just a way of having transparency, but privacy, right? In the sense of being honest where we're at, but it doesn't come with our who we are, which might feel a little safer. Okay. All right. So the inventory of the room that we've got 11 responders. 5 are experiencing both emotional and physical exhaustion. 5 are experiencing compassionate fatigue, and 1 is not struggling with either. Right? So again, just to normalize that this is often, many of us struggle with this or will struggle with this within our life. So thank you for participating. So stats. So we know that burnout is on the rise among Canadian employees, 35% in 2023 to 39% in 2025. So again, this is taken from Workplace Strategies for Mental Health. Burnout costs actually cost employers $5,500 to $28,000 per person. So again, just recognizing that this is something that we cannot ignore. It's on the rise. And so I'm trying to kind of take it from maybe different participant groupings even tonight. So if you look at the Barna group, they did a study in 2022, and they've noticed that 40% of pastors show a high risk of burnout. And so that's an almost 400% increase since 2015, when that number was only just 11%. And that comes from the Christian research organization, as I said, Barna Group, that provides data and insights on the trends affecting faith, culture, and ministry. Family caregivers. These are the folks that often fill in the growing gaps in healthcare systems, right? We know that. And it's taken from a study by Maple in 2025, 1,500 people online responded. And so we know that 63% of caregivers say that their role has negatively impacted their mental health. So hopefully this puts some normalization that if we don't take care of ourselves, or if we don't if things aren't even changed within our workplace in terms of expectations and demands, this can be expected, right? So, what are some of those myths that we might have about burnout? And I think the part, even just with me, was that I had done something wrong. How could I have contributed to my own burnout, my own sickness, thinking that I had done something wrong? And I think that's a common belief that a lot of us might carry. And I would even say that sometimes what prevents us from telling the story, like me, would have been shame, right? And so let's just dispel some of those myths so that you have a freedom to be honest. You can't burn out if you love what you do. So we know that burnout doesn't discriminate. Often passion for our work doesn't necessarily protect us. It can sometimes make us more vulnerable. Good helpers don't complain. So again, there's that myth that enforces silence and shame. Acknowledging your pain doesn't make you weak, it just makes you honest. So again, vulnerability is the beginning of healing. If I just pray harder, I won't feel compassionate fatigue. So yes, I recognize that prayer is essential. It's how we connect with God. It's it's a powerful weapon that we all should be using if we are people of faith. But God created us as physical, emotional, psychological, relational beings. And as you know, in this body, I'm sure I'm not the only one, there's limits, right? And so sleep, boundaries are not unspiritual. They're actually very wise, right? So, what are some of those early signs? Early warning signs. And I would say that often we either are unaware of what they are, we just ignore it because we don't feel like we have time, right? And so I always say that knowledge is powerful, which is again why if you can start identifying these early signs in yourself, we can start changing some of those patterns and routines. Because remember what I said earlier, self-awareness is the first step to change, right? We can't disrupt a pattern if we're not aware of the pattern, right? And sometimes we have wise counsel in our life who can see that, hey, I think you're working too much. You seem pretty irritable or you're retreating too much, right? So again, what are some of these signs, early signs? And physical exhaustion, sleep disruption, right? With the physical exhaustion, sometimes it's literally dragging your feet, right? Coming back to work after a weekend and feeling physically drained, difficulty falling asleep, early morning awakening, or oversleeping. We know that often our illnesses or sicknesses tend to increase when we have a rundown system, right? Um, and we know that often we can have or often emotional stress can be manifested in physical symptoms. We know that how stress can be actually very harmful to the body. And so if I look back in my journey, my early sign was flu symptoms on weekends. I was getting flu symptoms regularly on weekends. And it was my body's telling me, like, it was screaming to stop, stop, right? And so, what are your warning signs? Some of the behavioral signs, and again, when we are suffering, sometimes we engage in addictive behavior to kind of ease that pain. And it could have been something that maybe we struggled with before. But again, sometimes you might see an increase in substance use. Sometimes other addictions are brought into it, and that's workaholism. That can be, shopping. Sometimes it could be even excessive exercising, right? Whatever we do kind of to the excess. Absenteeism, right? Again, it could be like we're easily irritated or angry. Sometimes we have this sense of responsibility that if I don't do this, nobody's going to do this and it's never going to get done. And so there's this like heaviness in terms of, I would call it sometimes over responsibility. We tend to sometimes avoid certain people. When my son had some medical needs when he was younger, and he was in a lot of pain and suffering, I just remember driving home every day after work and literally wanting to turn my car and not go home because his suffering was so intolerable for me that it just broke my heart as a mother. And so part of me had that urge to want to avoid, but I also knew I needed to come home. But I use as an example, it's hard to be in the presence of others who are suffering at times. Fogginess, indecisiveness, and ability to make decisions. We tend to kind of forget details, right? It tends to then extend towards problems in relationships. Sometimes we're leaving a job. When I talked about compromised care, often an example would be that if somebody is diagnosed, say, with a health condition or a mental health condition, sometimes we could use code words and I'll just give you an example. There's lots of evidence behind this. When folks are diagnosed with borderline personality, sometimes they might be seen as manipulative. And I just recently heard of somebody who didn't get proper hospital care last week because of that diagnosis. So again, that would be an example of when we're not struggling, we sometimes tend to code people in certain ways due to our own tolerance for stress and not give them the adequate care that they deserve, that everybody deserves, right? Silencing. What I mean by that is that sometimes we unknowingly silence other people because, again, their information that they're sharing is too much for us. So when people are giving us details of their lives, we tend to focus more on the ones that are not distressing. And in that way, we're not saying it, but we're silencing them, right? And so, again, that could be unconscious. But again, those are some of the things that we might do. So what are some of the psychological signs? And again, I just read a couple from the PTSD scale, but again, emotional exhaustion, distancing, negative self-talk. That's like I would say that's like the critic voice within us that's really loud, right? We're self-loathing, self-depreciating. Depression can often be within that. Reduced ability to have sympathy and empathy. Sometimes you can see cynicism and embitterment, resentment, kind of like a feeling of dread as well when we know we have to care for somebody. And again, intrusive imaging or dreams or nightmares, and that can be, again, being exposed to other people's traumas. And I actually clustered them all together because there are, just to kind of make it easier in terms of there are a lot of overlapping symptoms. And so, yeah, the assessment tools on your table will, if you're really curious, feel free to take a picture of those assessment tools on the table that you can kind of bring home and take a look at maybe where you're at in terms of just gauging. A sense of helplessness, a diminished sense of enjoyment in life. You're getting your worldview changes. Kind of a hypersensitivity to any kind of emotionally charged situation. Loss of hope, right? So again, lots of ways in which it shows up in our psyche just to kind of pay attention to. And so this is the exercise that I'm not going to get you to do it just because of the time. But again, there's something on one of the handouts. It talks about an early detection system. And so when we if we use this as like a traffic light, the green zone is where you are and when you are at your best. The yellow is where we are most of our life. We have warning signs emerging, but guess what we do? We often ignore them. And the red zone is the danger zone. Often this is when we're on stress leave, we're clinically depressed, or we're totally withdrawn from others. And the anxiety is just really, really high. And so when we are suffering, first it hits us emotionally, physically, then it often goes to our relationships with our family and our friends and our colleagues, and eventually our clients. So learning to identify can help you begin to track these levels of emotional and physical depletion at the earliest sign, because we know that it's easier to create change when we're kind of at the earlier stage, right? Because when we do finally hit burnout, it's a bit of a longer recovery process. So again, the handout that's on the table, just take it home, maybe something to reflect on. I've heard time and time again, once we start to become aware of those warning signs and we kind of know our patterns, it's a much easier place to intervene. So again, I would encourage you just to kind of reflect on that later on. So stewarding your strengths, what do I mean by that? So again, often, as I said earlier, we feel responsible. We feel we failed. We've done something wrong to contribute to our own burnout, our own exhaustion. And so these are just some personality traits that we might all carry. People who burn out are actually high performers in many cases. And so maybe you identify with some of these tendencies. And these are things that I've learned about myself. So again, if you're a high empath, right? You, when people are talking, you feel like you can easily absorb others. You kind of understand their emotional state. You can kind of maybe pick it up with nonverbal language. Sometimes they were known as the radar kids. Do you remember that? The radar kids, the empath person. So again, recognizing that natural, intuitive, emotionally in tune, easily senses other people's feelings. These are all fantastic things. But if left alone, we can be absorbing things that don't belong to us, right? And so what can we do? practice emotional detachment. And you're like, Karen, what does that mean? I can feel with you, but I don't need to carry your burden, right? So sometimes in therapy, we talk about maybe a visual bubble, right? Whether it's a mental image of a bubble, a shield, or a cross around your heart. And you're just, using that kind of imagery as a protection that stands between you and that other person so that you're not absorbing it, right? And so often I will imagine a cross, God staying in the wake of me and that other person or me and my loved ones, so that I have clarity of what is mine and what is not, what I can do and what I can do. Another um, another personality type might be a type A, high achiever orientation. We know that they're driven to perform. They often skip breaks. They overschedule. And so, again, when you think about it in the workplace, just keeps coming. And really, it's not about you performing as it is really about the job and its expectations being unrealistic. You just keep going in that schedule. But the lie is you will never be caught up. And you have to come to a place where what can you let go? What is enough for that day so that you don't work yourself sick, right? So, this is where negotiating rest, celebrating small wins, like you might, if you're a person who likes to make lists, and even if you didn't get through all those lists and you only got through half of it and the time is done, I mean, again, those are still small victories. And so often most high achievers have difficulties with resting. Um, and so they tend to overcommit. And so when you think about burnout, it's chronic stress meets high personal investment plus limited recovery. And so rest is really, really important in that category. The other thing is if you are highly accountable, you're a reliable person, you care about results and outcomes, you want to make sure things are getting done properly. I would say that, those are good, but we also need to learn to delegate and develop realistic ownership. Prioritize what really matters. Learn to say no without guilt when your capacity is full. Acknowledge what is in your control. Relationship oriented, those might be for the folks who place, again, I always say that first and foremost, we were created for relationship for God and with each other. And so it's natural that we're biologically wired to be connected to each other. But when we place the relationship as the utmost importance, um, sometimes saying no is actually really difficult for us, right? And we tend to neglect our own needs. And I always say that a really good sign that you're doing too much in relationships, if you're starting to feel resentful, if that is starting to grow, that's often a fantastic indicator that you need to start setting some different boundaries, right? So if we prioritize connection and trust and cooperation in relationships, um, learning to set boundaries. Again, boundaries are not about controlling others as it is about protecting our own peace of mind and well-being. Learning assertiveness, and you might laugh when I say this, but I really try to help women become a little disagreeable and to say no, right? So many of our socializations is to be polite and kind, but not at sacrificing ourselves at all costs when we become unwell, right? So we want to steward our bodies as well as being just a kind and caring person. Emotional sensitivity. So these might be the folks who I think about neurodivergence, ADHD, autism. We know that they have more and greater emotional intensity and have difficulty down regulating, right? So we want to build some emotional resilience. How do we do that? Example would be like if, say, a supervisor gives a brief corrective feedback, often a person with high emotional reactivity might think that they're failing or they're a disappointment, right? So one of the strategies would that be write down the exact words, rate the intensity, then ask someone else what do they think, right? If this were someone else, what would I think? Um, so I think about autism and being overstimulated after a long meeting. You feel irritable, teary, or mentally foggy, too much sensory. Schedule some decompression before overload hits, right? Noise canceling for 10 minutes. So again, recognizing that God has made us all differently. He has given us gifts. He wants us to steward it. And so I really wanted to intentionally include this section so that it's like anything in life, right? It's our strengths can also be our weaknesses. And so let's just be aware of how they serve us well and how we need to not let them go boundlessly, right? Again, some of the influencing factors, these are familiar factors that add to compassionate fatigue or burnout. Our current personal stresses, relationship, family challenges, our own mental health struggles, workplace conditions, organizational influences, legislation changes and frustrations. I mean, I think that we've all been recognizing the growing political context of a lot of workplaces and having to live within that, how that has sometimes been challenging. Maturation factors is just really skill development, ability to handle life things, and we're not born with these skills. I always say that a lot of our life skills are developed and earned from practical experience. I'm still learning mine. I don't know about you guys. And then if we have like any type of physical or medical challenges, and most of us sometimes in our professional life or again, if we're caring for other people, that stress can be difficult and overwhelming. When things really start to get out of balance is when we have stress both in our personal life and our professional life, right? There's no breathing space. So there's like an accumulation of stress that sometimes can just really hit us hard, where it just feels overwhelming. And so if I just quickly just add, like when you think about, again, recognizing that burnout is really can be a workplace imposed, it's important for us to have strong supports, right? It's important for us to sometimes rebalance whatever our job roles or duties. Yeah, and even having professional development and ongoing training, right? There's nothing more overwhelming than being given something to do and you don't have the skills or the training, right? It's like you're going into it feeling overwhelmed. And unfortunately, how many work settings nowadays prepare us poorly, right? It almost feels like it has become the norm, which is sloppy, and that's not good employee practice, right? And I know that we're growing, but I think that there's certain sectors do require proper training, definitely. So what are some of these practical strategies? Taking stock, kind of what the plate exercise was about, taking stock of how you're feeling, understanding yourselves, right? Tracking some of your stressors at work and at home, tracking your physical well-being. So again, if you know that when you get sick, that's your immune system telling you that that's stress coming out, right? Again, it all shows up differently. Remember, for me, it was flu symptoms on weekends. Tracking and limiting your trauma inputs. When our cup is full, sometimes we don't have the tolerance to handle other people's. And guess what? Sometimes we need to be helped. And it's okay for us to say, I would love to help you. I'd love to be that person for you, but I just can't at this time. And I know that that's really hard to say. Enhance work-life balance. Again, these are some of the things practically in a work environment that helps. Flexible hours, working from home where possible. Not everybody has that option. Permitting those returning from a leave to gradually build up a full-time schedule rather than just being kind of dropped in and expected to carry full load like everybody else. Train managers. Leaders. As you guys know, in lots of companies, the leadership creates the culture, right? The families, the parents of the household create the culture. The pastoral team helped create the culture, right? And so it's really important to train folks who are in leadership roles how to serve and care for other people well. Encourage staff to stay home when they're sick or they have children sick or their parents, their relatives or elderly parents are needing care. Eliminate unnecessary meetings, communicate expectations clearly. If there's anything that I've seen consistently is a lack of role clarity. And so if we don't know what our role, if we don't have a clear understanding what our roles are, it's no wonder we're kind of all over the place. And, I suppose that's one of the benefits of having a union, if you're in a company, is that they keep managers and leaders, and they should keep people to their job description because in some ways it can serve as a protection and on many different levels. And again, allow staff to control their own priorities as much as possible. That's autonomy, self-agency. Enhance self-care. How do we do that? These are your, I'd say, your basic care that we all need. When people come see me in the therapy room, I say that, if we want to tackle this, we got to go back to kind of what your mind and body needs to refuel. So how are you sleeping? How much rest are you getting? And rest is not doing errands. Can I just say that again? If we are a task-oriented person and we're not working and we feel so good about being productive, my naturopath said to me, Karen, this is what she taught me. She's like, Karen, good stress and bad stress, the body doesn't distinguish the difference. It's just stress. And so often we think, if I'm doing errands, it's good, but the nervous system takes it as busyness, and over busy is not good for any of us, right? So yeah, taking care of our needs. I'm just mindful of time. I'm going to skip to develop resiliency skills. So again, those would be our stress reduction techniques. Last in my other presentation, I'd given a handout of window of tolerance. So again, just recognizing my nervous system, which is really, is it always idling high with anxiety, irritability, anger, and frustration, or is it running so low where I'm numb and I'm depleted and I feel lethargic, right? High and low is not good for us. It happens throughout the day, but we want to be aware of where we're at, and develop abilities for kind of clear thinking. And so if we go back to the plate, and again, this is something that I just want you to kind of take away. What would be one thing that you could take off your plate, right? What are some of those things that you literally could just take off, put a boundary around it, be a little bit more realistic and concrete. So yeah, so for later, what can you remove? What can you share, which is delegation or boundary setting? And if it stays, what mindset needs to shift? So I'll say that again. What can you remove? What can you share? Learn to delegate, set a boundary. Or if it does stay, how can we change our mindset to that? How can we shift our mindset to it? Entering rest. And these are for the believers in the room, who knows that in the Bible in Galatians 6, it talks about carrying each other's burdens. And in this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. And so we all are to seek and offer support. You don't have to be carrying your struggles alone. But we also know Galatians 6:5 speaks to each one should carry their own load. So We need to be aware of our capacity and set boundaries to protect our energy, and know your limits. We know that true rest is found in Christ. Um, our rest and our strength can come from Him, not only from breaks or efforts, right? And when I think about love with confidence, this is how love is made complete among us. In this world, we are like Jesus. And so we need to focus on our faith and reliance on God. But your effectiveness is not measured by tasks done. It rests in being united with God, love before proving, and trust God's work. And so when Jesus answered, the work of God is this, to believe in the one He has sent. Our only work is to trust, receive, and believe. And it's actually, again, it's cultural contrary. He's moving us from doing, producing, earning, achieving spiritual approval. The only task that we have is to trust and receive and believe. So final thoughts is you don't burn out because you care too much. You burn out because you've been caring too much for too long. Supportive roles are sacred, absolutely. Some of you are caring for aging parents, family members, but it should never come at the cost of your own health. Think about that airplane analogy, right? You can't give to others if you're depleted yourself, right? We've got to put the oxygen mask on ourselves. And how a person's responsibilities, expectations, and position in a workplace structure can either protect against or increase the risk for burnout. And so when you think about nowadays, there's many standards. It's called National Psychological Standard, I think, of health that's within workplaces now. I didn't say it perfectly, but there's certain standards now in terms of how is that being assessed? What are some of the changes that need to be made? And I just want to end with prayer of cleansing and renewal. And this was written by the founder of By Peace of Waters, Janine Schultz. And so she has been a great mentor to me. And I've just had the privilege of being able to work closely with her. And so I just like to close in this prayer. So I just want, when we think of blood, I want to ask the Lord Jesus to forgive us for any soulish or sinful ties or connections that we have made with those to whom we are ministering. Anything that we try to accomplish out of our own strength, anything that we are assuming responsibility for that is not ours, anything that the Holy Spirit brings to our minds that we need to give back to the Lord. I want to now ask the Lord to take His sword of truth and by the Holy Spirit to cut off any ungodly, sinful, soulish ties that we made with those to whom we are ministering and to reattach us to Himself. Water, I'd like to ask the Lord to wash over us with His rivers of living water, to cleanse away all defilement, false responsibility, control, fear, shame from our spirits, our hearts, our minds, and our physical bodies, to refresh us and to renew us with His life-giving streams. Lord Jesus, please fill us with your unconditional love, your perfect love that casts out all fear in every part of our beings. Lord Jesus, please pour your oil of anointing into every part of our being, spirit, soul, and body to heal, restore, soften, refresh, integrate the way He needs to, and to pour over our heads His oil of authority to anoint us for further service. Then I just want to praise and thank you, Lord, for who you are and what you have accomplished in us and through us. We adore you. You are worthy of our praise, and we cannot do this work without you. Amen. Yeah, and so sometimes, with that is there's like I would almost say it's like a disconnection, right? So we don't we feel like we're kind of looking at our life as it's a fog, like almost a detachment. Um, we don't feel real. We don't feel real. We don't feel we're actually participating in living. Does that make sense? Yeah. We're not an active participant in our life. It's just kind of through a fog. The autonomic nervous system. Yeah.
It's like the fight or flight.
Yes, so when you think about yeah, absolutely. So flight is kind of the anxiety, the irritability, the anger. Um, the freeze and the shutdown is kind of like the depression, the detachment, the tiredness, the dissociation sometimes, right? And so again, neither of those states are inherently wrong because life is difficult and we go through that. There's a middle state that's more it's more that kind of we're in that calm and clarity where we have confidence, right? We have curiosity, we have compassion. Um, Life stressors that come in on a daily basis often moves us in and out, but sometimes just like behavior, our nervous system develops a pattern. And so sometimes we can be permanent, especially with trauma, we can be permanently stuck in a fight or flight response. We're idling high all the time. And I always say that if anybody has struggled with anxiety in the room, it's hard to be anxious all the time. Eventually, your nervous system will shut it down and you just collapse, right? So, yeah, so fight flight is the higher end, and the bottom end is more freeze, shut down. It is. And so again, it's not about judging ourselves harshly, as it's more just about tracking yourself, what's causing you to disconnect. And are you disconnected at such a level that it's interfering in relationships? It's interfering actually being fully present in your life, which is the derealization. Um, or are you so anxious and overwhelmed that it might come across as you're trying to control everybody else. Everything else has to be perfect. You can't handle frustration, right? So, again, these are just good markers to help us understand what's going on. And um, yeah, and depression often rests more in kind of the shutdown, right? The shutdown state. Yeah. So first of all, let's just acknowledge that it's going to be a bit of a it's going to be a process to regroup, right? Because you've already had probably impact emotionally, physically, and psychologically, right? And so I would say the rest part, right? Kind of taking care of going back to the basics, the nutrition, right? The sleep, the appointments that you need to, any medical appointments. Um, and then again, if burnout is related to the work environment, right? Um, Sometimes those are difficult conversations to see about what needs to shift in your work responsibilities, right? What is it about within that culture that maybe the demand is too high? And even though we can't change sometimes the workload, sometimes we could set limits for ourselves, realistic limits for ourselves, right? When we get to a place of returning. But I would say that if we are on in that red zone where we're unwell and we're out of the workplace, that's when just taking care of all those physical, the emotional, and mental, and then maybe even sometimes going to therapy can be really helpful to help you instill boundaries. Um, and again, if you want to get a really good book that helps with that, this is where I got a lot of my information from, is the Compassionate Fatigue workbook that is by Frances Matte. And so that might give you some, again, practical ways in which you can, and so learning to say no, right? But again, I'm always very careful about the personal ownership because it's not our fault if a workplace has unrealistic expectations on us. And so sometimes it's about not absorbing the culture or the expectations. And so we use all our tools to stay healthy. And if that is still not enough, then we have to ask ourselves, is this an environment that we want to continue to work in? And I know that's a difficult question. I know that's a difficult question because sometimes it's not so easy. right? Um, yeah. So when we are needing to heal, it's literally at that point just taking care of ourselves in very practical, basic ways. Well, I guess again, if you're burnt out, I mean, if you're working for a company, right? So when you think about HR would be involved with that, right? And so sometimes if you're on a leave, okay. Um, yeah, I mean, so a lot of times I've worked with a lot of people within the therapy room in terms of burnout. So that's why I did that plate exercise to try to figure out what are some of those contributing factors in your life that may have contributed to this burnout, right? And so, what are the things that we can change, and what are the things that we cannot change, right? And so, again, sometimes just making note. What are all? Often we sometimes we can take on, we can overcommit, or we can take on too much, or sometimes, as I said, maybe we've been in a stage, we've been in a season of caregiving for so long that it's actually starting to really affect our own mental health. And so we need to start prioritizing, what do we need? How can we delegate that responsibility, right? Um, but again, when we are just kind of in the beginning stages of recovery, um, again, I would say rest can help with burnout. Rest can help with burnout, right? Um, and maybe, also when I think about recovery, really reducing what you commit yourself to do. Right. So one of my so the two things that I found was really helpful is learning how to pace. So pacing yourself based on your energy and your ability. So pacing, sometimes I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the spoon analogy is that we only have so many spoons every day based on our health, based on our abilities. And so just know how many spoons you have every day and be intentional of where you're going to use that spoon. Because if you are not realistic of what you can and cannot do, you might expand your energy by 10 o'clock in the morning, and the rest of the day you have no energy left, right? So we want to be realistic of our abilities, and then learn how to pace that. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing. These are weighty. Like these are weighty, a weightiness that we all carry, right? So our heart is heavy. Our mind is heavy, right? And so sometimes we actually just need an outlet, honestly, an outlet to express how we've been impacted. And what's interesting is when we are giving to others all the time, sometimes we actually don't actually sit and reflect on what's happening in us. And so, honestly, sometimes just having confidential space where we can actually be honest and be truth tellers of our own story